Before there was a written language, human beings made images. Before they wrote anything down, they began to exhibit their ability to think symbolically by making images. This ability to think symbolically and communicate with language and with art is unique to human beings. This ability sets us apart from other animals, and the ability to make images may have given us an advantage over our Neanderthal counterparts. This ability may have helped us communicate with one another, and it may have helped us discover new technologies and new tools. At any rate, we begin to see human beings communicate and think symbolically when we look at the art of prehistoric peoples. Before there was a written language, human beings made images, and for prehistoric people, the images that they left are the only evidence that we have of their culture, the only thing that they left behind, since we have nothing written down about them. In that sense, images are our window into their cultural experience.
The very first artifacts made by human hands date back 1.65 million years. They are small, carved hand axes. But then, 30 or 40,000 years ago, human beings began to make representational images. Archaeologists can only guess as to why these paintings were made. Some have argued that these images were meant to represent the animals dead or asleep, in the belief that hunters would then find the animals in similar states out in the real world. Were these caves related to shamanistic rituals? Or what about the fact that these images were found deep inside caves that could only be accessed with great difficulty? Unfortunately, without a written record, these questions will remain a mystery. This lion human is an example of representational sculpture. It is a representation, but it is more than a representation because it communicates the imaginative world of its maker. Rather than simply imitating nature, the artist has created something that goes beyond nature. The figure is part human and part beast, not something that can be found in the natural world, and so the imagination is required to create something like this. This sculpture reveals the inner workings of a human mind. Throughout this lecture, we will see that art always communicates something about the beliefs, values, and logic of a particular culture, perhaps not an individual, but at least a culture. This is a sculpture in the round, which means that you can walk all around the sculpture. Other early sculptures in the round were these small female figurines that were found all over Europe. They come from the Upper Paleolithic period. On the left, you see the woman from Willendorf. She was found in Austria and is dated from 24,000 BCE. The wide hips and large breasts may have meant that this little figure, which is only a little over 4 inches tall, represents fertility and the survival and continuation of the clan. These small-scale female figures were once called Venus figures, which implied a religious association. But this has not yet been proven, because the name Venus references the Roman goddess of love and beauty. And assigning that name to a culture that existed long before the Roman Empire is a little bit anachronistic. There's no evidence that this statue is actually related to religious ritual or the history of the ideals of feminine beauty. So that reminds us of the danger of importing our own cultural assumptions onto a work of art. We must always learn about the work of art from the perspective of the people who made it. Take the time to learn about the cultural context surrounding the work. That's what archaeology is for. In this case, it's more accurate to call these figurines women and to look at them in context. Figurines such as the woman of Willendorf are similar to those such as others that were found in the similar region. So, in fact, these figures may have functioned to communicate shared values and friendliness among different groups of Paleolithic peoples. Archaeologists suspect that because so many of them have been found in a variety of places, we know that they were exchanged between different cultures. In this lecture, we will see that the impulse to abstraction is just as prevalent among human beings as the impulse to representation. There are many reasons humans abstract their images. Abstract is not the same as non-objective or non-representational. because abstract means that the image is rooted in a recognizable representation, but that the artist has abstracted from that original reference. So in this case, the case of the woman of Rasampui, it probably comes from about 30,000 years ago, and the forms that make up the figure and its features are reduced to basic shapes. The representation is an abstraction. It's not intended to replicate nature exactly. Contemporary British sculptor Anthony Caro has said that all art is basically Paleolithic or Neolithic, either the urge to smear soot and grease on cave walls or pile stone on stone. That's a quote from your text, from Getling, Living with Art. This means that not only did early humans imaginatively represent what they saw around them, they also created huge structures. These were spaces with a purpose. The purpose of a huge structure could be a gathering place for human communities, a burial place, a space for ritual, or a place where heaven meets earth. We have one such example with Stonehenge. It's a megalithic structure. Megalithic means big stone. It's made during the Neolithic period. Neolithic means new stone. The labor of a whole community was necessary for the construction of Stonehenge. It made it a feat of social organization more than anything else. Scholars believe that Stonehenge was the site of ceremonies that were linked to death and burial. This theory has been constructed from evidence found in the surrounding context of Stonehenge. Similar wooden settlements are found nearby, and the evidence suggests that their inhabitants traveled great distances to the site in order to perform rituals related to the dead. The archaeological research required to understand Stonehenge reminds us of the importance of putting all art historical artifacts in their cultural context. Without that archaeological research, we would not know what Stonehenge is all about. Elsewhere, as time went on, human beings became even more organized and sophisticated in their ability to pile stone on stone. Ziggurats have shrines set at the top, making them meeting places for humans and gods. They function symbolically as bridges between heaven and earth. And thus we have arrived at Mesopotamia. In 3100 BCE, in southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians developed the first form of writing. They pressed symbols into clay tablets. And in this period, art displayed the power of kings representing it and solidifying it by communicating messages of strength and ferocity to enemies and subjects alike. We're in the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. There, and this is where we're looking. Mesopotamia is right here. Egypt would be over here, Babylon down here, Jerusalem, present-day Turkey, Greece. A ruler who preserved his legacy with an impressive building program is Nebuchadnezzar II. In 605 to 562 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt Babylon into a splendid city. Part of that project included the Ishtar Gate, what you can see here, the ceremonial entrance to the city, decorated with tiers of dragons that were sacred to Marduk. So you can see decoration here, lions, and symbols of the goddess Ishtar. It's against a blue background made of blue glazed bricks. It's an incredible project, and today it's rebuilt in a German museum. Do you see how cultural values impact art? One of the most important things you'll learn in this course will be to investigate the cultural context. I think I've said that already a couple times, and I will continue to repeat it. Of any work, do not just take a look and move on. Learn the backstory, because works of art tell the stories of different cultures. In addition, I want everyone to understand that most art throughout history is not the product of the vision of one individual. Instead, most art throughout history is the product of a whole culture. In the case of Mesopotamia, it's the result of the wishes of a ruler, not the result of the wishes of the individual craftsperson. Today, in this lecture, we'll see how cultural values, beliefs, and experiences affect artistic production. For the rest of the lecture, we'll be looking at Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Pay special attention to figurative sculpture. These three cultures influenced one another, but they had their own distinct take on figurative sculpture. So we'll see the similarities and differences. Here are a couple more Mesopotamian reliefs. Again, to solidify and enhance the power of the ruler. Now turning to Egypt, artists were required to follow conventions in art making. They did not change. Those conventions did not change for thousands of years. An artist had to follow the 1,000-year-old tradition rather than invent a new way of representing things. What does this tell us about the cultural values of Egyptians? If we know that art did not change, that was static for thousands of years, it might tell us something about the enduring power of Egyptian pharaohs. Something solid, like the stone out of which these sculptures are carved. The Egyptian belief, starting in the early dynastic period, was that the kings were gods in human form, descendants of the sun god Ra. In the Old Kingdom, rulers, those gods in human form, were typically portrayed as athletic, youthful figures wearing the royal kilts and headcloth. Permanence and dignity are aspects of these portrayals of kings. Two examples here are the statues of Khafre and Menkaure, both from the 4th dynasty. The figure of Menkaure is standing in a conventional balanced pose with one foot forward, and we will see how this pose influences early Greek statues later in the lecture. On the other hand, this scribe from the 5th dynasty shows a different side of Old Kingdom. This scribe is seated working at his profession. Rather than the tight body of the king, the scribe has a sagging stomach. Rather than the idealized impersonal face, his face is active and alert, as if he's engaged in the act of looking and observing, which a scribe would have done. His pupils are slightly off-center, which gives the illusion that his eyes are moving. The butcher is also depicted at work, cutting up an ox. He's standing on tiptoe in a very active position. He's in the middle of his task. A sculpture such as this would have been included in a tomb. He would have been a servant to the dead in the afterlife. Which brings us to pyramids, an even bigger example of stones piled on stone. They are forms of commemoration, the commemoration of Egyptian kings who are buried inside of them. Excuse me. The Egyptians used art to display the power of their pharaohs. Thus, while individuals who were not of royal descent were typically represented in more lifelike poses in Old Kingdom sculpture, the idealization of Egyptian kings continued into the New Kingdom, which starts in 1539 BCE. The problem with depicting idealized figures sometimes comes when reality does not fit well with the ideal. And an example of this here is with the female Egyptian king Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was a woman, but she was depicted as a king because there was no convention for the depiction of women. So she adapted to the convention and is here depicted as a seated male king. Thus, sculptures portraying Hatshepsut as a male king reflect the power of tradition and the power of the artistic convention in Egypt. It was so strong that even her gender could not change it. We'll see the influence of Egypt's figurative sculpture on ancient Greece. You can see the comparison now, and let's talk about that. Like Egyptian sculptures, Greek kuroi are rigidly frontal, with the left foot slightly advanced. Greeks sought to depict the ideal human body. We can see their progression of their sculptures in these three images here. The first, Matikos Apollo, is an offering to Apollo from about 700 BCE. The second two are statues called kuroi. That means they're also grave markers. They're based off of the Egyptian format. And you can see the time period. It's not that long a long time of a period through which this transformation took place. The left foot is slightly advanced, as I mentioned. The fists are clenched to the side, just as we saw with the Egyptian statue. But on the other hand, the Greek sculptures are a little bit less permanent. Instead, the Greek artists are trying to depict movement already. You can get the sense of the rectangular shape of the original block, but the figures are released from the block. They're completely released from the block of stone, unlike in this case. The Greeks are here already interested in the nude, which is another contrast with the Egyptians. We'll see this nudity continue through the centuries in Greek art. The desire for Greek artists to improve upon existing artistic trends resulted in dramatic changes. I said that in Egypt, nothing changed for 1,000 years. We can see that within less than 200 years, a lot has already changed in Greek sculpture. Rather than reject the past, however, artists of this period built on the past to create these new stylistic changes. The Greek classical period saw sculpture change very dramatically. And here are some female examples. Here we see the use of contrapposto. So here already, the body is so much more realistic in the Krytos boy. There's a sense of movement rather than stiffness. Instead of one foot in front of the other, like in the Egyptian kings, now the figure is standing on one foot. That's what contrapposto means. It refers to this presenting of the standing figures with opposing alternations of tension and relaxation around the central axis. That's the convention that dominates Greek classical art. Standing on one foot, tension on one side, relaxation on the other. Sculpture is highly realistic. It's based on observation of the material physical world. But along with imitating what they see, Greeks also bring their values to the sculpture. During the classical period, the value was placed on human reason over emotion. Reason and rationalism sought mathematical harmony. Since man is the measure of all things, balance and harmony then are found in relation to the human being. So this idea of the human being, the ideal, is manifest in figural sculpture. Greeks come up with democracy and the idealization of the individual, and thus the individual body is elevated. For Greeks, divinity is located in the bodies of beautiful and ideal gods. So in contrast, for example, Christians also believe that God is incarnate in the body, that there's Jesus Christ as a God in human form, but Christ's body is broken rather than idealized. Rather than human beings made in the image of God, the Greeks made gods in their own image, based on their idea of the perfect human being. And you see that even with the Greek gods, that they're sort of like human beings. In their quest for the ideal, Greeks pursued theories that defined beauty. So they had their definitions, and it related to harmony, proportion, symmetry, orderliness. Balance and harmony are what they're looking for. Man is the measure of all things. Later in the Hellenistic period, however, you can see here, life becomes more unstable for the Greeks. Their depictions of humans then become more emotional and dramatic. There's emotion interjected here. Can you see how much more emotional this sculpture is than these? How static these figures are, how their faces don't express much. What a difference here we can see, and also in this image, of the pain experienced, anguish. This period comes after the death of Alexander the Great, and knowing that cultural fact helps us understand how cultural context influences a shift in values and how that shift is represented in art. In contrast to Greek art, Roman portrait sculpture is not based on eternal ideals, but it's based in a different cultural tradition. The Romans had a tradition of the veneration of their ancestors through death masks. This practice merges then with figural sculpture, and so the Roman ideal in portrait sculpture is distinctly different than the Greek ideal. The Roman ideal is to actually depict wrinkles, imperfections. The Greeks never do that. They always idealize and smooth over the human face. Romans emphasize individual likeness. They observe individuals, and that's what's important in Roman portraiture. In addition, Roman emperors continue to solidify their power with portraiture. The emperor couldn't be everywhere at the same time within his empire, but his image could. His image became a stand-in for his presence. So here, the Greek contrapposto posed is combined with imperial propaganda. We have Augustus with Cupid at his feet, which is a reference to his divine lineage, or at least what he claimed to be his divine lineage. His chest has little figures on it, and it tells the narrative of a diplomatic victory. So it's imperial propaganda. The Roman Empire had such far reach that we're still influenced by it. The Roman Empire has shaped our buildings, our laws, our language, and even our coins. An important technological innovation that changed Roman architecture was that of concrete. Concrete allowed the Romans to create the curved walls of the Pantheon, for example. Thus, we see another important point, which is that new technologies influence the evolution of art. As new technologies develop, new forms of art and architecture become possible. Technological innovation is another aspect of cultural context, just like beliefs, values, geography, experiences of war or instability, or who the leaders are at the time. All of these factors influence art. We will not fully understand a work of art unless we learn about all of the cultural context surrounding it.